Dear guests, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to IVA, the Royal Swedish Academy of Engineering Sciences, the first of its kind in the world. I'm really very happy to open this seminar for OECD Science, Technology and Innovation Outlook 2023, and I warmly welcome Director Gerard Sheehan to IVA. You're so welcome. This seminar will address the global developments in research and innovation, which of course these days is really important for all countries that I can imagine. And we really hope that this discussion that we will have today will really feed into the policy discussion in Sweden, which is ongoing, and also facilitate our national discussions on how to continue as a highly competitive knowledge economy also in the future. So I'm very happy to welcome, after a while, our Minister for Education, Mats Persson, and State Secretary for Business and Industry, Sara Modig. You're also very welcome. We will also have reflections on the global developments from our 4 science and innovation counselors from around the world. And for IVA, it's almost like a homecoming for counselors, since this organization was actually once initiated by IVA in the middle of the 20th century. And as moderator today, we warmly welcome Professor Sylvia Schwag-Sergel on the stage. Sylvia is the most renowned expert of international research and innovation, and she's currently a professor at Lund University. So welcome, Sylvia.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tula, and it's a pleasure to be here at the seminar today and to guide you through 90 minutes, which I think will be very packed, but also hopefully very informative. So we will first have the presentation by the new Director for Science, Technology and Innovation at the OECD, Gerard Sheehan, followed by sort of an international outlook by the Office of Science and Innovation Counselors of the Swedish government from a few of the countries where they are stationed. And then we will have some comments from the Minister of Education, Mats Persson, and the State Secretary for Business and Enterprise, Sara Modig. And then we will have a closing panel where Jerry will join, the Minister of Education will join, and Sara Masur from the Knut and Alice Wallenberg Foundation. So I think we have an excellent program, and the challenge will be to keep the time. And that's my job, but if you can help me in the discussion also with relatively short answers, and try to be also short in your questions, because we do invite questions from the audience, particularly for the panel at the end. And if there's time in the other parts, then also. I should say 2 more things. Please take a note of the exits, the emergency exits. I think they're right there in the 2 corners. And also, as I said, this session will be recorded, so there's also an online audience. And we welcome questions, but unfortunately, we cannot take any questions from the people who are participating online. So it's only the people who are in the room. Having said all of that, I just have 2 quotes, which I think really set the scene, and I will repeat these quotes this afternoon in our session on science diplomacy. But Xi Jinping said already in 2021, we will win the battle in key core technologies. We will resolutely win the battle in key core technologies. And Mark Warner, a senator from the US, in a seminar this summer said, global technology competition is the geopolitical issue of our time. And I think that's a good framing for this seminar, and something we will probably be coming back to. And with that, I would like to welcome Jerry. We're very happy to get your summary of the OECD Science, Technology and Innovation Outlook 2023. Please, go ahead.
Okay, well, good morning, and thank you for that kind introduction. Thank you for the invitation to be here with you today for this event. It's especially meaningful for me to be able to join an event here at the Royal Swedish Academy of Engineering Sciences. I'm both a trained engineer and policymaker, and so I have a keen insight into the role of engineering and engineers in advancing in science, applying it to technology and innovation to help grow our economies and help make our societies more robust and more meaningful. As noted, I'm going to speak to you today about the findings of the STI Outlook, the Science, Technology and Innovation Outlook 2023, which was published just at the beginning of this year and has a subtitle of Enabling Transitions in Times of Disruption, which which I think captures very well the essence of the times that we're living in now and actually provides an even more clarion call for science, technology, and innovation to help us through these times of transitions. Very good. Okay. As I was preparing for today's remarks, I was reminded that my first visit to Sweden was about 20 years ago to present the results of the STI Outlook 2002. In the intervening years, a number of things have remained the same. When I was here 20 years ago, Sweden was also on the very left-hand side of this chart, right? Sweden has been and has remained one of the key drivers of innovation, with among the highest spending on R&D as a share of GDP in the world, certainly among the OECD countries, standing at about 3.5%. Sweden was then, and continues to this day, to remain actively involved in discussions, international discussions of STI policy, through participation in OECD committees on science and technology policy, and many of its working groups. In fact, I won't call him out by name. We have the chair of one of those working groups from Sweden who's here with us today. Sweden has also been a country that has come to the OECD numerous times to seek reviews of the innovation system, its research system, and performance, constantly seeking to improve in innovation and innovation policies. That's what's remained the same. What's happened over the course of the last 20 years, though, is that the context in which our science, technology, and innovation models are being applied has changed radically. And that's what the STI Outlook for 2023 highlights for us. I'm not going to give you a comprehensive review of all of the elements in the STI Outlook, but I do want to focus on 4 key themes that I think are here with us today and are going to continue into the future and shape the way we need to develop STI policies for the future. The first of these are the disruptive shocks and global crises that have placed greater emphasis on the resilience of STI systems and on the role of STI in helping society remain resilient. The second are about concerns about climate change that are calling for greater directionality and emphasis and focus in our STI policy, which means we need to think differently about some of the policy instruments and mixes that we use. As was mentioned in the introduction in the setting, there are mounting geopolitical tensions now that are contributing to a greater securitization of STI policy, which also presents some challenges that we need to navigate. And of course, both as a solution to some of these challenges and raising some new concerns, are emerging technologies that are also initiating renewed calls for technology governance to help us ensure we see more of the benefit and we minimize and address the risks that new technologies can pose. So together, it's these 4 key trends that are causing us to have to rethink the way we do STI policy in 2023 and going forward. So let me say a word about each of these, and we'll start with the disruptive shocks and crises. I don't think for any of you it's a surprise, right, to recognize COVID-19 and the pandemic. I was told this is one of the first gatherings right out in this room of this size after the pandemic. We're still coming out of this massive change and crisis, but a very different one from an OECD and an economic perspective. This is one of the first economic recessions that occurred without declining expenditures in R&D. In fact, across the OECD, on aggregate, R&D expenditures during the first couple of years of the pandemic grew by 2% and accelerated at a 4% rate between 2020 and 2021. This trend, as you can see, was also true in Sweden, though at lower levels. But again, we saw investments in R&D as part of the solution to the crisis. This is because we were making a lot of investments in health and life sciences related research as we were looking for treatments and vaccines. Also the investments that were being made in information technologies that helped us continue to work remotely, live remotely, and continue to make advances in our societies. So this demonstrates really 2 related trends. One is the resilience of the science system itself, and then the other is the contribution that science makes to resilience in our communities and in our societies. This has also raised expectations for STI policy. We demonstrated that science, technology, and innovation could help us through these times, and I think we did pretty well with that. So the question is, what can we learn from this past experience that's going to help us as we enter into the next crisis, whatever form it might take? And I'll identify just a couple of key areas. One is recognizing the role of sustained investments in science, technology, and innovation, in the human capital, in the research infrastructures that support it. It's true that we were able to, during the COVID crisis, we were able to develop vaccines in record time. But we were able to do that because we had 30 years of research building up on messenger RNA that put us in a position where we could react and respond. More than that, we found that successful R&D and STI required strong collaboration, not just within the research community, but among researchers, practitioners, engineers, policymakers, and others. Where those relationships pre-existed in the normal times, we tended to do better. Where those relationships hadn't been well established before, sometimes between the research community, for example, and the public health community, we needed to strengthen those relationships, and that's more where we stumbled. What this means is we need to be more anticipatory. We don't know what the next crisis will be. We have some ideas, but we can put in place mechanisms to better anticipate it and identify the capabilities and the capacities we need to put them in place now, so we're ready to respond using the resources and tools we have in place rather than trying to create them anew. This is going to become increasingly important as we move on to what we might consider the next or the current crisis that we're in now related to climate change. My colleagues at the International Energy Agency, the IEA, indicate that 50% of the technologies that we're going to need to decarbonize our economies and meet our climate goals for 2050 are not yet on the market, meaning they're in prototype stage, they're in laboratory, they're still in a research setting. Despite this, expenditures on energy-related and low-carbon technology R&D are growing, but only slowly. They haven't reached the levels they were at in the 1970s around energy investments when we were trying to deal with the oil crisis then. So there's a need to examine our research portfolios and ensure that we're investing enough in this important area. At the same time, though, we need to think about how we provide the greater shift in these investments to make sure that we get out of them the advances that we need. When we consider the broad policy mix just for funding business R&D, we've actually found that over the last many years, governments have been shifting their support away from direct support of business R&D and more toward R&D tax incentives, which are probably better suited to more near-term R&D activities than they are to prompting major transitions. 33 out of the 38 OECD countries today have tax incentives for R&D, including Sweden, and now more than 60% of total government support for R&D comes through these incentives, rather than up from about 36% in 2006. Both types of measures play a role in our policy mix, but as we think about climate change and how we want to shift and encourage R&D in particular fields, we may need to be more attentive to how we balance these two. And in fact, Sweden, with a smaller investment in R&D tax incentives, smaller costs, may be better positioned than some other countries in that way. But the other thing that we need to keep in mind as we try to move toward more mission-oriented R&D, more mission-oriented STI to address these crises, is we need to think much, much more broadly than the R&D investment itself. We need to think about how to encourage multiple actors and ministries and policymakers to work together toward common goals and solutions. We need to steer and we want to innovate at a pace and scale that's going to help us achieve our net zero targets. We looked in the STI Outlook at about 80 different net zero missions recently launched around the world, including here in Sweden. And we found that they do provide broader coordination of policy initiatives across ministries as we need. And they help integrate support instruments in better ways than we've done in the past. But nevertheless, these programs often fall short in resulting in transformative change often because they lack sufficient scale, especially in reaching the non-STI components of ministries, and they sometimes lack the political support and adaptation and incentive structures to make them more effective. At the same time, while addressing climate change, right, we know we're going to need greater international collaboration. This is a global crisis that all countries need to play a role in trying to address. We're doing this in a context of growing competition and geopolitical tensions. You can see on the slide here, while OECD countries remain the leaders in STI, as many of you know, we face increasing competition from outside the OECD region, from countries that may or may not share the same values and approaches to innovation as we tend to among the OECD countries. As an example, right, China is now the second largest funder of R&D in the world, and its growth in R&D has been accompanied by a growth in the number of research publications, the quality of those publications, the number of patents, and other measures of innovation where they've come up in the ranks globally. The growing ascendance of non-OECD member countries in STI raises three major concerns for those of us within the OECD. One is rising competition in critical technologies that are going to be important for ensuring future competitiveness and helping us address climate change, some of which also have national security implications. We also see diverging values and interests that could in fact undermine the existing international order. And there is growing vulnerability in supply chain interdependencies, whether it's in semiconductors or rare earth minerals that are critical for innovation. And governments, in fact, are responding. We're seeing concepts like technological sovereignty, strategic autonomy taking root to reduce interdependency risks, enhance industrial performance, and strengthen international STI alliances among, quote, like-minded countries. In the Outlook, we describe some of these policy responses in three categories: protection, promotion, and projection. So protection are measures that tend to restrict technology flows and reduce dependency risks. Promotion are those efforts to enhance domestic innovation capabilities, often through the kind of mission-oriented innovation policies that we're going to need for climate change. And projection is trying to strengthen and extend international linkages through alliances, bilateral and multilateral as well, and participation in standards development organizations. We can see these, as I said, in areas such as semiconductors and critical minerals. They're being coupled now with new guidelines for research integrity and research security. And this creates a new challenge for policymaking, where we need to think, though, about how to emphasize the cross-departmental issues and coordinate accordingly. These issues of competitiveness and security and sustainability are all related goals. They're all sometimes influenced by different ministries and different actors in the innovation system, and we need that kind of coordination across ministries. We also suggest that these issues need to be addressed more on a case-by-case basis than in a blanket manner, weighing the options and implementing measured responses to address particular concerns in particular fields around particular technologies. And we see quite a bit of opportunity to strengthen strategic intelligence, again, horizon scanning, foresighting, technology assessment and evaluations, to ensure that we can make the right decisions in turbulent and uncertain times. We in the OECD play an active role in this as well in helping coordinate responses among like-minded governments, like-minded countries, to avoid inefficient subsidy races from emerging. Again, a lot of these issues around global competition and competitiveness are premised on emerging technologies, which themselves, right, raise these global issues, but also raise questions about ensuring that we get the more promise out of emerging technologies, AI, quantum computing, synthetic biology, and others. These all carry considerable risks and challenge as well as benefits. And we only need to look at some of the debates that are happening now around generative AI to get an understanding of some of the challenges that we face. Among the OECD countries, I think we're increasingly asserting the notion of shared values: democracy, human rights, sustainability, openness, responsibility, security, and resilience need to somehow be embedded in the technologies we're developing and the STI systems that produce them. And these concerns are becoming increasingly important to think about how governments can shape the governance of technologies which are developed in individual labs, individual companies that may have few opportunities for coordination as we try to identify certain guardrails that we can put in place. We offer in the Outlook a few messages on technology governance. The first is to have a demand at the national and international levels for guidance on these issues. How do we embed foundational values in technology? How do we have to bring innovators and societal stakeholders, again, breaking out of just our STI systems into a process of technology governance. We have in the Outlook the beginnings of an anticipatory framework for governing emerging technologies at both the national and the international levels. It consists of 3 tiers: identifying our values, establishing design criteria for ensuring that new technologies comport with our values, and a set of tools like forward-looking technology assessment, societal and stakeholder engagement, and co-development, deployment, and implementation of soft law, recommendations, and principles that help steer the responsible development of technology. These are issues that we're going to be taking up within the OECD in a number of ways. We established earlier this year a global forum on technology that is bringing together multiple stakeholders from around the world around key issues and key technologies such as quantum, synthetic biology, and immersive environments. We're also, in my advertisement here, planning a ministerial meeting of the Committee for Science and Technology Policy in April of 2024, which will have, as part of its mandate, advancing frameworks for both technology governance and using STI to advance transitions such as climate. What I can say is then that these 4 themes that I highlighted, resilience against shocks, greater directionality in STI systems, particular for climate, mounting geopolitical tensions and securitization, and governance of emerging technology are going to be trends that will be with us in the Outlook and ones in which I think OECD and international cooperation can help address. I know that Sweden is going to be an important player in those discussions through the engagements you take, through the willingness to continue to examine and adapt your own STI and innovation system. And I'm looking forward to today's discussion to get better insight into how we can tailor some of these broad recommendations and themes to the Swedish context. Let me thank you again for the invitation to be here today, and I look forward to engaging with you in the discussion to follow. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Jerry. I think a really succinct and excellent summary of the many messages and the important messages from this report, and we'll have time to get back to them hopefully in the panel. So I would now like to ask the Science and Innovation Counselors to come up and stand at these tables. And we have 4 of them. We have Marika Amatay, who's the counselor in the UK. We have, why don't you stand here? We have Per-Arne Wikström, who is the counselor in India, who should maybe stand at the very end because he's the tallest. We have Maria Brogren, counselor based in Washington, D.C. And last but not least, Tina Karlberg, based in Beijing. Welcome. And what Jerry said, I think essentially, what the STI Outlook is talking about is increasing geopolitical frictions and systemic competition, disruptive technologies, the need to find global solutions to the climate crisis, the resilience of STI systems, and last but not least, these disruptive technologies that we're all dealing with. So I think we have an excellent food for thought that we would like to hear your opinions. And I'm just going to ask a few questions. We have about 15 minutes left, if we can get through them. If you have any questions, please raise your hands. Otherwise, hopefully, there will be some time during the panel. So I think I'm going to start with Maria. Brugren from Washington, D.C. I have a lot of questions based also on what Jerry said, but maybe a very concrete one. I don't know if you've been following that the US and China have had a science and technology collaboration agreement that's been in operation, I think, for 44 years. And the big discussion right now is whether this S&T agreement will be renewed. And I think it speaks very much to what you were talking about, Jerry, that we need to collaborate, but we also have this increasing competition that is affecting everything we do. So Maria, my question to you, where is the US headed, do you think, in the science and technology collaboration with China and with this agreement?
Yes, well, the US has 60 such agreements, science and technology agreements with different countries, and Sweden is one of those. And they are really important and valued by the US government. So they put a lot of effort into these. And the one with China has been in place since 1979, I think. And I mean, you're probably aware that there are many, many Chinese students at the US universities, and a very high fraction of the PhD students, particularly in the STEM topics, are from China. So the US is really dependent on this influx of researchers and the collaboration. So this is a really tough question, because at the same time you have this, you want to become less dependent on this. So what the government has done right now, because the science and technology agreement, that was it was expiring in the end of August. So what they did, having these two, wanting to protect, but also wanting to stimulate research cooperation, and having this dependency from influx of research talent from China. So they have now prolonged the S&T agreement with 6 months. So, and the discussion is that during this time, we will have the dialogue with China around sort of red lines and how can we put guardrails on the research cooperation. So, well, I'm only speculating now in the future, but I think that there will be really, intense discussions during this time. And given this huge dependence from the university, I think that they will come to a solution.
Thank you. So I guess a slightly optimistic note that at least they're not rushing to end it by extending it. You mentioned two more interesting things that were also tied to Jerry very briefly. I mean, one is you mentioned that the US still attracts a lot of global talent. With all that's happened in the US in the last 5 years or more, how attractive is the US still to global talent, would you say?
I think the OECD has done studies on this, and it's still ranking as attractive. It's in the sort of top 5, top 8. And what's lowering the score is the visa problems, that it's really difficult to get a visa and also to stay after your studies. And the Trump administration put more restrictions in place, and now the Biden administration is trying to sort of soften this a little, because they want, of course, if the students have gotten their education in the US, they want them to stay. So it is attractive, but that you have these sort of hurdles.
Thank you very much. And then my final question, because Jerry talked about the need to regulate for technology governance. And I guess a very short answer maybe, how serious is the US, do you think, in regulating AI, about regulating AI?
Well, the US is, as usually, very reluctant to regulate. So what they are now discussing, or the government is discussing with the large tech companies, and want them to sort of commit to voluntary guidelines. And the administration is issued something that is called a blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights. So it's just that, we want you to do this, but it's not really regulation.
Exactly.
So at the same time, the Biden administration is also, the issue of inclusion, non-discrimination, diversity is really important. So it's they have also to weigh these two issues.
Thanks a lot, Maya. Tons of interesting issues, and unfortunately not enough time. But we'll move on to the UK. The UK is interesting, I think, for Sweden for many reasons again, but not least because it's trying really to establish itself as a leader in AI. And do you want to tell us a little bit, Mike, about how is it going about that? And what are some of the things maybe that would be interesting for Sweden to know, since Sweden is also a country that right now is looking at how to perhaps position itself in AI?
It's still a bold statement, isn't it, to become an AI global leader. If you're in the company of China, US, and the EU. But the UK is very much willing to do this. And I'd like to give you a little bit of background. I think it's important to remember that the UK hasn't been part of the Horizon programs for almost 3 years. It was only last week that we found out that they will finally associate to the research program that is so important for not only British researchers and universities, but also for Swedish and the EU's. So we're happy about that, but we have seen a repositioning and a consolidation of the UK government, of course, in every policy, but also so within innovation and research. And I would like to give you a little bit of a insight into the organization, because it leads up to why they have now decided to take the lead, or try to take the lead, when it comes to the AI development. So they have created a ministry, a sole ministry for research, innovation, and science. They've actually done the complete opposite of the Swedish government. They have created a department for energy security and net zero. They have created one department for business and trade, and one for science, innovation, and technology. And they also, which I find is very interesting, they have a horizontal National Science and Technology Council that sits with the cabinet, chaired by the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak. And this means that innovation and science can touch any department within the British government. This new ministry, it was established in March this year, so it's all very new. They published a framework for science and technology, and this framework has identified 5 critical technologies that will not only drive the UK as what they call a science superpower, they're bold here too, aren't they, in their policy rhetoric, but also for economic growth. Rishi Sunak has put innovation and science at the core of economic growth. And these 5 critical technologies are AI, quantum, semiconductors, engineering, biology, and the future telecommunications. So with all of these 5, they have a national strategy for all of them. They have an earmarked innovation and research money. To get to the AI positioning, they published a white paper on AI. I think it's 1 or 2 years ago. They raced with EU. They wanted to publish this before the EU. I don't think they succeeded, but it was very much a middle ground position. EU being the more regulatory approach, and the US more liberal line. So it's interesting to see how they are also trying to navigate within the different systems. So why? Why do they think that they can become an AI leader? Well, they claim that they have the absolute leading universities in the world. They have top talent, and they're as good as the US to attract talent. They have a very high number of unicorns. And most of the big Silicon Valley companies now have headquarters, their European quarters set in London. One example of how they are organizing themselves globally is that they will host an AI summit on AI development in, I think it's November this year. A number of countries, it remains to be seen which, will be invited to this summit. In the long run, they would like to see an international organization for AI established in the UK.
Thank you very much. Very interesting to hear about this ambition and the plans behind it. And also, of course, as you said, these strategies for the critical technologies are also quite nicely matched by a very ambitious industrial strategy, which also was presented. So we hear about these two countries that are still very attractive to global talent, but have their own struggles, as you said, the visa system, which I guess is not unusual, but it is an issue, a big issue in the US. I do think, listening from the Chinese side, we might come back to that, Tina, that also Chinese students are starting to wonder how welcome they are in the US and in the UK, as you said, the strongest universities. I can't help but commenting that as the mother of a daughter who just graduated from a UK university, they're also struggling a lot with teacher strikes, which has significantly disrupted students' experience in the UK. But anyway, thank you very much. We're running out of time, but I'd like to turn to Per-Arne. India is perhaps not mentioned enough when it comes to international science, technology, and innovation for many reasons. It'd be really interesting to hear from you briefly. How does India navigate this rapidly changing STI landscape?
Thank you. Okay, so I think first we need to look at India. What is India today? And we have a country that now is the largest one, population-wise. It's the fifth largest economy. They're expecting to become the third one in a couple of years' time. Half of the population is under 25 years old. So it's a very young population. The economy is booming. The growth is almost 8% at the moment this year. So there is something going on in this country. When it comes to how India is dealing with this, I would say, if we focus on science innovation in Sweden, that is interesting. Would be that first of all we can see that India is going in different directions. They are trying to connect with the world through different groups like BRICS, they had the G20 now, the Quad and all that. They have relationships with China, of course, but not much. You have Russia. They're trying not to take the stand, but instead having a lot of opportunities in this rapid development that is ongoing. It was interesting to see that they actually mentioned the International Solar Alliance in the G20 report that came after G20. We also have the collaboration through LEAD-IT that is interesting as well that they mention. India love two things: making business and keeping up relationships. Sweden has an extremely strong position in India, backed up by more than 100 years of industrial presence in India. So the Swedish large companies, they have established created a position in India that facilitates collaboration through business-oriented research collaboration, which fits Sweden very well because we have a multiple helix approach here, right? So I think looking forward, or going forward, the strong bonds with India through business relationships, but also since we have been there for such a long time, makes it possible for Sweden to maintain this very strong position. I can just mention that just recently Sweden was pointed out as one of the 12 most important business markets for India, which is, it's the only small country that is mentioned in that respect. So yeah, so that's a small introduction to what's going on in this exciting country.
Thanks a lot, Per-Arne. And I think it is a very complicated country, but definitely one that we should pay perhaps a lot more attention to also in science, technology, and innovation. And as you talked about, I think what's really interesting is going on is this alliance building in different facets. So last but not least, we turn to China. And I waited with China because if you read the OECD STI Outlook, I was going to count how many times China is mentioned, but it's a lot. So, and it's like the elephant in the room in a lot of these discussions right now. How are we going to relate to China? So Tina, based in Beijing, perhaps the first quick question, if there's anything else you want, but the first quick question is, China with Xi Jinping has also tried to turn science to some extent inward. It's encouraging Chinese scientists to publish more in Chinese. It is harder to engage in international collaboration with China. Would you say, where do you see China in this rapidly changing? How is China viewing, the rest of the world and international S&T collaboration?
Well, if you look from the Chinese perspective, it's not that different, actually. I mean, the country is vastly different. It's a party state, but the strategies are not that different. I was smiling a bit when you talked about UK, because it's a lot that is similar. And also when you are relating to those 3 Ps, the protect, the promote, and project, that's also what they do and have done for a long time. So I mean, they are also getting more and more sort of assertive in how they go about this. But I think importantly, science and technology and innovation were actually given its own chapter in Xi Jinping's speech about the state of the nation and going forward in the Party Congress last year. And I think that says a lot about how they view STI as a driver. It's a production force in Chinese terminology. And this is also, of course, then mirrored in how they invest, how they are also very targeting their strategic areas in a very holistic way, I should say. I mean, with both education being increased, industrial promotion activities and science, etc., to make sure that they actually go ahead with the strategic areas such as AI, quantum, deep sea explorations, and space, things that they have picked up as strategic.
Very interesting. And unfortunately, we're running out of time, but I would also refer to Tina. I think you just recently published a newsletter, because we didn't get to talk about AI and China, but China, speaking about where to position yourself in regulation, is also pursuing a very different but interesting approach, with, of course, a lot of concern on foreign influence and the control of the state, but also increasingly concern for the individual. Is there anything more you'd like to say about?
No. Well, I mean, they are regulating, of course. This is China, and I think it will be interesting to see how this will play out in relation to the censorship of the country. But the second thing that could be interesting to point out is that they are also very keen to be one of the big players on the global scene when you talk about regulating AI, not least in terms of ethics, but possibly also the military stage. But they will want to do it on their terms. So I think there's a very long road ahead.
There is, I think so too. We're maybe 2 minutes behind, but I think we'll catch them up. I would like to finish off, because you are both all placed in very interesting geographies right now. Maybe just 1 or 2 words from where you are at right now geographically. And given that there's a lot going on in Sweden for research and innovation policy, we're about to have the Minister of Education giving us his remarks. What do you think we should be keeping an eye out when it comes to STI in your relative geographies? Is there something of interest you'd like to mention? Who would like to start?
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, as I said, we have very good relationship with India. They have looked at Sweden now when they develop their infrastructure for science and innovation. So they have an excellent system that suits Sweden perfectly when it comes to smart specialization, for instance, regional collaboration, but also collaboration with incubators, innovators, and such. And a message I would bring on to this table would be that we need to use this, because it's basically inspired by the Swedish way to do things.
That's great. Thank you. Maria?
Yes, well, as you know, the US has had all these huge bills with a lot of spending, and it's, I mean, the purpose is to promote jobs in the US and sort of decrease the dependency on China, for example, but most of this is focused on the green transition. So that's an area where they are mobilizing resources, and also I want to mention that Sweden and the US has this science and technology agreement, and under that we have just signed an implementing arrangement which increases or facilitates collaboration with the US national labs in the area of energy research. So that is now an open opportunity for Swedish researchers to connect more to the national labs in the area of energy.
Thank you. Tina?
Well, we have had a lot of discussions last year, not least about the risks of doing business and doing innovation and research with China. That has been sort of the overarching subject. I think it is really dangerous for us as a research-dependent nation to let the de-risking go into decoupling and not be there. That is a major risk to not collaborate with China. So look for the Chinese excellence. So I think that is a really, really important thing. We need to learn how to manage risks in collaborating with China and not to avoid them completely.
Thank you very much. And finally, very briefly,
yes, very quick. UK has left the EU. They're still our friend. They're very much our research friend and partner. But we have to organize ourselves. We have to build these new bilateral platforms for dialogue. And I just want to mention the strategic partnership agreement that Rishi Sunak and our Prime Minister agreed on in June. It's 3 pillars. It has defense and security, innovation and research, and trade as their priority areas. Believe you me, we will fill this with content. But please come and help us with it if you have ideas.
Thank you very much. I want to thank the counselors for, I think, was an excellent outlook. Thank you. Please take a seat. So now, with a short delay, which I'm confident we'll catch up with, it's my pleasure to welcome Mats Persson, the Minister of Education, to give his comments on the OECD Science, Technology and Innovation Outlook. Please, the floor is yours.
I think I'm going to stand over here, I think. Dear audience, dear hosts, dear colleagues, and thank you for inviting me to this important and interesting event. I think the discussion in the panel was very interesting to take part of. And thank you for a very interesting and very important report. And I think the OECD STI Outlook, I think it's really important for Sweden to have an external view of the global landscape and also on the Swedish landscape, in particular when it comes to research questions. Let me first thank you for the presentation of the report and these important views on how geopolitics is shaping global science, the tech industry and innovation policies are very important. And also the long-standing trends and also the discussion. You can open any international newspaper to take part of this, the recent disruptions and what that have created. And it's a new challenge for the world, it's new challenges for Sweden. The whole STI sector and all of us need to address these growing geopolitical tensions and challenges, and we need to do that in a well-informed, cautious and also ambitious way, with great awareness and capacities to act. And I will also take the opportunity to thank you who joined the panel. I think it was really important to take part of really interesting to take part of the discussion. And this also shows the importance of a global collaboration and the importance from a Swedish perspective to also listen to stakeholders from different countries. So thank you. Today we are living in times where the pandemic, the Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, the climate change, the digital transformation, strategic competition, this is the mega trends that we all are challenging. And it asks a lot of questions and challenges for a small, smart country such as Sweden. And the scientific rise of China and the rapid, perhaps unprecedented, increase in international academic cooperation and competition is new questions that put new challenges to Sweden. And altogether, these developments are creating a new context which is starting to extensively affect the trajectory and patterns of scientific collaboration. But we will always have to keep and safeguard the principles that foster cooperation and openness in internationalization, since it's crucial to reinforce our economic and technological development and also our security. And therefore, it's essential to strike the right balance between supporting openness to international cooperation on one hand, and the awareness of related threats and risk on the other hand. And I think science, technology, and innovation is essential to building capacity for resilience and adaptation to different global shocks or macroeconomic shocks. And it can only do so effectively if we also are well prepared to respond to known risks, but also to unknown uncertainties. And I think the 6 different chapters in the Outlook are it's very important, and they explore central trends and topics at the global level. Not only about strategic competition and the governance of emerging technology, but also on mission-oriented innovation policy for net zero and the importance of global STI response and system for sustainability transitions. And all these are being discussed in the report. I think it's very important. And as the panel were discussing, a lot of things are happening in the big countries in the world at the moment. And the last, I think it was in the weekend, I guess, the G20 meeting was taking place. And the development, all the bigger nations in the world are acting. We have the IRA or IRA in the US. We have the development in China for a long time. We have the development in India, which has taken place rapidly at the moment. And of course, we have the new policy from UK. So this is four examples of big countries, both population-wise, but also economically and historically, that are now changing their policy in a response to those global trends. To some extent, honestly, also, of course, as a response to the development in China, of course. So it's a new world taking place where the WTO, World Trade Organization, is not on anyone's mouth anymore. It's a different issues at the moment. And I think a great challenge ahead will be to deal with these challenges regarding strategic competition and these security issues. And we need to address global challenges, also such the climate change or future pandemics. Climate change is a very important issue for the Swedish government. Sweden have a tradition of being a front runner in terms of climate change. Actually, as a Swede, I'm proud of being one of the few countries in the world where we have decreased our emissions at the same time as the economy has been booming. Since 1990, the emission in Sweden have reduced by one third. So that's something for other countries to look at, and something for other. I'm proud as a Swede. We have to do more, but we have been doing a lot of things, and we have had the possibility to combine reducing CO2 emission at the same time having a booming economy. I think that's important for other countries to analyze and to look at Sweden, not at least countries who starting their economic journey from a different level. The strategic issues and the issues regarding climate change, they go hand in hand. The Swedish government will, in the bill, who will be decided this fall, we will, for example, make great investments in research and innovation regarding battery research, for example. We announced that last week. So we are now changing our policy where we will have more cooperation with the industry, and we will take strategic investments in different areas regarding, for example, climate change. I think that it's important for Sweden, because we are front runners, to not standing still, but always trying to improve our policy, and this is one way to do it. Looking from a national perspective, Sweden ranks fourth in terms of research and development expenditure as a percentage of GDP. I think Sweden, we are approximately 3.4% of our GDP. It's unfortunately only a smaller increase has taken place compared to 2010. And in fact, if you go back to the beginning of the 2000s, it's actually decreasing. And in the countries that are ahead of Sweden, for example, Israel, Korea, and the United States, significant increases in research and development spending have been taking place since 2010. And the President Biden's IRA project or IRA bill will presumably only increase the proportion in the United States. So it's a new environment for Sweden. Sweden are a small and smart country. That's a basic of the Swedish society. We're an innovation country built by engineers and historically. And if we stand still, other countries will come ahead us. So we experience a significant international competition, not at least from China, which today has the most researchers in the world. And if you look at the publication lists, if you look at the rankings, the derivate of the curve for China is very steep upwards. So investments in research and development has grown globally, and mainly in advanced digitalization and emerging technologies. And also, of course, this implies that there is a need for investments in, also the investments in defense research have increased. And this is also, of course, something that will increase in the future. So in the light of this, Sweden's position as a leading research nation needs to be strengthened, and free research needs to be protected. Sweden is, I would say, well on track, but we play in the Champions League. We play in the same league as some of the best countries in the world, and there is no room for slowing down or standing still, because other countries are investing heavily in science, technology, and innovation. And there is a clear risk that Sweden will fall behind. As a consequence, the Swedish government has announced that we will have a strategy for STEM, science, technology, engineering, and maths. It's a part of the new policy in Sweden. It's actually, I would say, a bit embarrassing that we haven't had such a strategy before, but now we are taking the first steps to implement such a strategy. I think it's important that the academia and the industry work more together in order to fulfill our potential as a country. The twin green and digital transition creates huge possibilities, but we don't want to experience a scenario where businesses choose to invest their resources in other countries than Sweden. So it's highly important for the government to have more investments in research and development in Sweden. And it's my clear ambition to take determined action to increase the quality of Swedish research and to strengthen the conditions for research-intensive innovation. I'm sure many of you by now know that the focus of the government's research and innovation policy is excellence, internationalization, and innovation. These three aspects will be laying the foundation for the government's work with the upcoming research and innovation policy bill. And I think in an age where knowledge resistance and foreign information manipulation are increasingly widespread, free and open research needs to be safeguarded, and international research collaboration must be conducted in a responsible way. Because free research is an undisputable component of the open and democratic society. Higher education and research are crucial for Sweden's supply of skills and for Sweden to be able to be competitive and to meet the different societal challenges. A clear orientation towards excellence and trustworthiness is required for Swedish research to be competitive and to be able to respond to the different challenges. So research and innovation must be conducted with high quality and efficiency, and continued investments in research innovation must be built on the importance of new knowledge and competence, and that they contribute to Swedish competitiveness, to growth and to welfare, but also to retain and attract key competence in Sweden. As I mentioned before, excellence, internationalization, and innovation will be in focus in the upcoming research and innovation policy bill. And during the fall and throughout 2024, the work with this bill will be intensified. And an important element of this is to work together with different stakeholders in the society. And the government have therefore invited over 300 organizations to support us with inputs and comments. Finally, this is a very important outlook, very important report. I think it addresses several of the big challenges around the global challenges around the world. And for a small, smart country such as Sweden, it's important to invest, it's important to collaborate, but it's also important to take strategic steps in a more modern direction, and to look and analyze what other countries are doing, and to build a new policy based on internationalization, excellence, and innovation. That would be the founding elements of the future policy of the Swedish government. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister, for outlining the challenges that Sweden is facing and also some of the initiatives you're taking. You will be joining us for the panel, so I'm hoping we can come back to some questions. You mentioned in passing, for example, I know the government has launched an investigation into how universities can continue with responsible internationalization. You've also proposed investments in engineering education. These are some of the responses I think you're taking in response to the challenges you've outlined. But we hope to come back to that. Thank you for this. So please have a seat. And then we would like to welcome the State Secretary for Business and Industry, Sara Modig, to give her perspective based on the report presented by Jerry Sheehan. Please, go ahead.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I would like to thank OECD for a very interesting report. And also say thank you to Eva for organizing this event. It's always great to be here at Eva visiting you. To begin with, the OECD STI Outlook shows that we are living in a time of big changes. And what makes this even more complicated is that we face many challenges at the same time. The Swedish government shares this view and recognizes that it has important implications for the development of science, technology, and innovation, and for policymakers. The STI Outlook is important because it gives us the opportunity to discuss the bigger picture and macro trends. It's a chance to discuss how crises and challenges to our way of life relate to scientific and technological development. It also tells us about the need to prioritize. The report highlights some interesting examples of how Europe, the US, and China are dealing with grand challenges through a variety of government support actions. I agree that ambitious research and innovation policies are key for meeting the challenges at hand. Another important message from the report is that we need research and innovation to prepare ourselves for meeting future challenges we don't know anything about yet. However, we should also not lose faith in the power of free market, even when we go through hard times. The Swedish government believes that Europe should avoid going into a state subsidiary race with other global actors. Instead, we should adjust and improve the support system that are already in place. I also note that the report discussed the importance of energy policy, and I couldn't agree more. The Swedish government recognizes that clean energy and electrification are two of the main avenues for enabling the green transition. The green transition is ongoing in all parts of Sweden, with innovative companies taking the lead. I am particularly excited about what's happening in the northern part of Sweden, where new factories for batteries and fossil-free steel productions are being built as we speak. The challenges of finding enough skilled labor for the green transition mentioned in the report is also something we need to handle here in Sweden. This is crucial for building a sustainable industry for the green transition. So how do we mobilize our limited resources to be successful in these areas? One important instrument is, of course, the Common Research and Innovation Bill, as Mats Persson mentioned. We are also developing a strategy for the industrialization of northern Sweden. And we're looking into ways of creating more efficient regulations, incentives, and less red tapes for innovation. Together, these initiatives should provide a framework with a long-term perspective that makes it easier for the private sector to invest in research, innovation, and green solutions. I agree with the report on the importance of collaboration. Sweden has a long and successful history of close cooperation between academia, business, and public authorities. Cross-sector and cross-border collaboration have been key elements of our innovation capacity, and it will continue to be crucial to stay globally competitive. Sweden is also very much an export-oriented country. Our companies rely on innovation to be successful on the global arena, but we can't take our current position for granted. We need to focus on areas where we have the greatest leverage and where we have a competitive advantage. And in order to do this, we need to pay close attention to the global development in science, technology, and innovation. Therefore, the OECD STI Outlook is an important source of knowledge for the Swedish government. So thank you again.
Thank you very much, State Secretary, for your comments, also highlighting the importance of, for example, Sweden's energy, both opportunities and challenges in the energy policy. With that, I would like to now invite the Minister, Mats Persson, Sara Masur and Jerry Sheehan to join me here in a panel. And if you could come up while you're coming up, I would like to introduce Sara Masur, who has both a very long-standing experience from industry. Among other things, she was vice president and head of research at Ericsson. And I think for the last 4 or 5 years, she's been working for the Knut and Alice Wallenberg, or the foundations of the Wallenberg Foundations, which, according to some statistics, is the second largest private research funder in Europe. I'm not sure if that's correct. So, Sara, since you have not had a chance to speak, I think you have a few slides because we're looking to you because you combine both industrial experience and the research funding side, with the Wallenberg Foundation having made enormous investments in trying to keep Sweden ahead, as both the State Secretary mentioned and the Minister of Education. So please, would you like to start by giving us a perspective?
Thank you, and thank you, Eva, for organizing this seminar on a super important topic and for inviting me. So, as Sylvia said, I have a background from industry, working 23 years for Ericsson and the last 6 years as the head of research at Ericsson. So I would like to start with a short background look. So if you can have my next slide, please. Yes. So this is a slide that I made in 2017, so it's a bit old. It was at that time based on the dialogue that we had in the Swedish Industry Research Council, which was a council where we met all heads of research and CTOs from the large companies. And this was advice to the Swedish government at that time on things that we were super important to implement for Sweden to move ahead. And I should start by saying it makes me extremely happy to listen to the minister today, because it was like music to my ears and very encouraging for the future. But some of the things that we said were very important, and then we should keep in mind that this is based on 2017, so it has doesn't have enough focus on climate, sustainability, and energy, because that was not as urgent if you go back 6 years in time. But some of the things we said: invest in research and education in ICT and software technologies and development for Sweden to be successful. Invest in research and industrialization of new materials, and this for sure has a bearing on sustainability for the future. Full-scale test and demonstration facilities, open arenas for companies to be able to come and try these new technologies. And this is not as important for the big companies because they can afford it themselves, but for the small and medium-sized companies, it's super important. Investment in the common digital infrastructure. Increase incentives to do research and development in Sweden. And I would also like to add early production, because that is a huge source of innovation, and also stimulate cooperation between small and large and medium-sized companies in Sweden. So if you go back a few years in time, I would have said at that time nothing has happened. That is not entirely true, because we have, for instance, seen that we have an initiative that is called Advanced Digitalization, an initiative driven by Vinnova that works exactly with this test and demonstration facilities, and that has now received extended funding and prolonged funding. So now the funding from the next year is 500 million Swedish crowns with public funding, and then also co-funded by industry up to 1 billion Swedish crowns per year. So that is really good news. And listening to the minister, we have a common interest in increasing the incentives to do research development in Sweden. That is super important for the future. So looking into the future, I'm optimistic. Things are happening. If we go to the next slide. So what are we doing from the Wallenberg Foundation? Well, we are the largest private funder of research at Swedish universities in the areas of science, technology, and mathematics. Every year we fund research with 2.5 billion Swedish crowns, and around half of that goes into individual grants for excellent, brilliant researchers working with free researcher-initiated research, and around half of it goes into our strategic programs. So altogether, these strategic programs, they're very long-term, so for the coming 10 years, we're funding them with 13 billion Swedish crowns. The areas are specifically selected in areas where we think it's crucial for Sweden to build competence in order for Sweden to be long-term successful. And the entire mission for the foundation is to be landsgagneliga, and it's an old Swedish word that means for the benefit or for the betterment of Sweden. And as you can see, it's exactly those technology areas that we talked about previously. So we have 3 clusters, one around computer science, where we have AI, autonomous systems, and software, the WASP program that was started in 2015. We have the quantum technology program. We have our investments in a new supercomputer for Sweden, Sweden's largest supercomputer, for AI calculations. We have the red cluster around life science, where we have data-driven life science, but also things as synthetic biology that we talked about. And then we have the green cluster with material science, and specifically the WISE initiative is Wallenberg Initiative Material Science for Sustainability. And 2 of the focus areas are green energy and also circularity, avoiding, for instance, rare earth minerals in the development. We started in 2009 with the Wallenberg Wood Science Center, and since then this has expanded. One of the ambitions is to build competence for Sweden. So looking all of these programs together, we are running huge graduate schools with over 1,300 PhDs in these critical areas. If you look only in the WASP program, AI, autonomous systems, and software, over 600. Today we have 400 PhD students in the graduate school. We have 100 that have already graduated. And then we checked recently, where are they today? Very encouraging, 65 in Swedish industry, 35 in Swedish academia or out on postdoc, and around 5 that have left the country. So our ambition is to keep them in Sweden, and obviously, at least for the first batch, we have been very successful. In all of these initiatives, collaboration with the Swedish industry is critical, and Swedish society. So out of the 1,300 PhD students, at least 325 should be industrial PhD students. Similar, 600 postdocs, at least 120 industrial postdocs. We also have our program for innovation. It is called VALP, the Wallenberg Launchpad. And as a foundation, we cannot support commercial activities. So what we're doing is we're giving research grants for the development of a proof of concept, prototype, or research validation, with the ambition to help our researchers to, in parallel to building a company, also build a proof of concept to make it easier for them to attract funding to build new companies for Sweden. We started in 2017, so we have granted around 64 proof of concept grants, and that has actually resulted in around 40 new companies in Sweden. So it works. And I already talked about the supercomputer. So does this work? Yes. Is it enough? No. But listening to the minister, very encouraging for the future. This is one example. It's the ranking on AI. Many of you may have seen it. It's from Tortoise Media. How is Sweden doing? Well, we are currently on place 17. Since I started following this, we have dropped from 12 to 14 and now 17. Now, there are good news and less good news. Good news is that when it comes to talent, we are number 15, which is fairly good. We are a small country, but still attractive. And I think this also has a lot of bearing on that we're building competence in the WASP program. Looking at research, we're also doing fairly good. Infrastructure, not so good. So going back to slide number 1, invest in a common digital infrastructure would be, I think we would raise this. And the area where we are not so good is on government strategy. But this is, of course, history. I mean, this is looking back, listening to the minister. It looks much more encouraging for the future. So 17 is maybe okay-ish, but I think we can do better. And we can do much better if we work together between public sector, between academia, and between industry. So I'm very positive for the future. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Sarah. I think excellent. And I think your investments in AI, material science, wood science, are things that a lot of other countries envy us for because they are rather unique. But I think as you finished, and with all the strategy in the world, we cannot correct for the fact that we are a small country. And also when we looked at these large investments or the large countries, you know, one of the things, and this is one of my questions to all three of you, being a small country, we will never have access to the same amount of data or the same market as the US and as China do. And at the end of the day, and today we have heard very little so far, for example, also about where this leaves Europe. So I guess one of my questions would be to all three of you, what else could or should Sweden be doing? And we do well in these, or relatively well. I think what this morning has shown is that we're doing well in technologies. We're a technologically advanced country, also leading in a lot of sustainability fields. But in this rapidly moving world where everybody talks about they're the giants, they're the first movers, there's regulation happening around us, what can Sweden or should Sweden be doing more of? I think you were hinting at some of that, Sara. And from all of you, I'd like to hear maybe a comment about that, because we've talked about some of these challenges, also some of the strengths, but given the geopolitical landscape of where we are and how big we are. Who would like to start?
I can start. I think one challenge is what we've been talking about today is the new world, and particularly in terms of the new trade policies taking place, which will be a big challenge in a problematic way, I think, for small, smart countries such as Sweden, where the globalization will presumably take a step back. We have already seen that, and if you open Financial Times or any magazine or newspaper in the world, you will see the same discussion taking place. So I think the first thing to do is to start comparing yourself with the same type of countries. And I think small, smart countries is a good start. So if you take this list, it would be Netherlands, Israel, Denmark, etc. Because we can't compare ourselves with China or US. We can learn from the big countries, but we have to adopt and have policies and strategies that are more in line with what other small and smart countries are doing. So I think that's the first step.
A very good point. Thank you. Any Sara or Jerry?
Well, I think we will never be able to beat or to compete with China and US and the big ones in terms of the massive amount of resources that they have. That's completely unrealistic. But what we can do is we can focus on niches where we have great assets in Sweden, and I think in those niches we can be world leading. And then also we should also recognize that we are really good at innovation in Sweden. We are very innovative, but we have a problem with enabling the innovations to stay in Sweden, to build sustainable Swedish companies. That is something to build on. We're good at cooperating, but I think we can do even better. But that's a strength that we have. We also have many industries in Sweden that are non-competing and that can collaborate. That's also a strength. I think if we do some of the initiatives that the minister talked about, continue and do even better in financing research, build a national strategy so that we actually know what is important to focus on and then focus on that, I think we can improve a lot. And we should compare ourselves, as you said, to the small, smart countries, not to US and China. They're in a different league. But still, for instance, one example, the quantum program, we are building a quantum computer in Gothenburg at Chalmers. I often get the question, why are you investing in building a quantum computer at Chalmers? Well, they're actually very good. Not in terms of number of qubits, we are currently at 25, whereas the big ones are on 100. But if you look at the quality of the qubits, they're second in the world, second to only IBM. And this is coming out of Sweden. It's great.
Thank you. I want to also say I'm prepared to take some questions, so please raise your hands, and then while I let Jerry answer.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I think just to build on the remarks that were said, I think for a country like Sweden, small and smart and innovative, I think there are probably two key factors. I mean, one is the notion of having clear strategic foci, right? In a country with an R&D and an STI environment the size of Sweden's, you do need to identify where your strategic opportunities are and your strategic niches are. And I think we've heard some of that in the discussion today. The focus on battery technologies, right? We have work at OECD that's been looking at what you've been doing to decarbonize the steel industry and others. And of course, building on the great strengths around ICT. But I think having a strategy or a set of strategies is critically important. And then complementing those with strong international collaboration, international and multinational collaborations, right? How to better tap into technology and knowledge and research that's taking place elsewhere, helping formulate some of the multinational agreements that will ensure greater openness and accessibility of data and information of resources is going to be critically important. And that can be done, again, individually in multinational environments, perhaps in collaboration with some other peer countries as well.
Thank you. Sarah, did you have a quick comment?
Yes, I forgot to say one thing that I think is important. If we look back in history, we have been very successful in some areas, and looking, for instance, at Ericsson, the world leading telecommunication company. I think Ericsson had a lot of benefit with collaborating with Televerket at that time. So going back to building a stronger partnership between public players and industry, I think is really good. And I think we should do it, perhaps not only looking at Sweden this time, but more in the European perspective. But try to partner with our own industry. I think that could build a lot of value.
Thanks a lot. And thanks for bringing the European perspectives, because that would have been one of my questions. We have a question there in the back, please.
Yes, thank you. My name is Ulf Kruse. I run a business network for engaging companies together. I would object to the view from Sarah and Sarah saying that we have a long history of cooperation. We don't in Sweden. And if you measure, so it's a question for Jerry, if you measure internationally by a study described here, we are laggards when it comes to cooperation. Do you measure cooperation between like companies, academia, governments, and are there any champions there?
Go ahead, Jerry.
Yeah. So there is some work that is trying to measure those kinds of relationships. Sometimes it's done in co-patenting analyses. Sometimes it's on co-publication analyses. There's also data showing the flow of funding, right, between the private sector and public sector research universities and so forth. So I think there are ways of coming up with comparable indicators so you can measure Sweden's position in that and track it over time. Those are not, they're not the most robust indicators, but I think they're the ones that we can collect in more internationally comparable ways. I do think there are some leaders in doing this, many of which have, sometimes it's a history, right, of movement of people and individuals between public and private sectors. I can look at my home country in the US as well, right? The careers of many have moved from an industry position into a government position and into academia. Having that kind of permeability, which takes a lot of policy attention, is important for human resources. Also ensuring that there are clear mechanisms and channels in place for moving knowledge from the public research system into industry, whether that's through programs around open data and open science, right? Ensuring that the results of research are widely and readily available. Again, different types of mobility programs. What are the positions around intellectual property and the roles of universities in helping support the commercialization, whether through patenting and licensing, whether through spin-offs and startups from other countries. So it's a whole host of policies that need to be in place to make that happen, but also then I think a tradition that needs to develop that recognizes that kind of mobility and transfer is something to be recognized and rewarded.
Thanks a lot. And I know the challenge came to you, but there's 2-3 questions in the room that I just want to take and then give you guys the opportunity to respond.
But can I very quickly respond?
Okay, but we need a microphone here and a microphone there.
I disagree. In the WASP program today, we have around 100 Swedish companies that are part of the program, supporting the program with, if you look at the funding, it's 6.2 billion Swedish crowns. 5 out of those come from the foundation. More than 1 billion comes from Swedish industry in the form of industrial PhD students, industrial postdocs, and supporting of research arenas. So I definitely think we have a lot of collaboration. Saying that, I think you're right, though, when it comes to mobility between public sector and industry, we can do better, and we should think about how we can really incentivize that for the future.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay, I have a question.
However, your view is not supported by international studies.
We'll have to, exactly, thank you. Go ahead.
My view is based by fact. You can have the numbers.
Thank you very much for very interesting presentations. My name is Sarah Omal Anderson, Professor of Health and Welfare Technology at Mary-Dolan University. Thank you for the OECD report. I missed 2 things. So we are talking about STI, which is not in isolation. It has to be in the ecosystem of economic growth and population dynamics and health. And I would like to understand how you see that, when knowing that we have OECD countries which are suffering from older populations, a larger proportion of people who are growing older, but also with chronic diseases, which cost a lot of money for society and healthcare. And also having other regions, like Mr. Wikström talked about, India, 25% people, 50% who are 25 years, but other regions in Sub-Saharan Africa where we have 70% under 30 years. So how do you see those dynamics in the 3 Ps of the government policies, especially when it comes to the projection policies?
Thank you. Excellent question. We'll take 2 more. Please be very brief. You here. Johan, please.
Thank you. Johan Kuylenstierna. I'm the Director General of Format, one of the research councils in Sweden. Really interesting, and it adds a little bit, I think, to that question. The disruptive technologies and shifts we are seeing right now are also disruptive for society as a whole. I'm less I'm very optimistic about the technological development, that we can solve a lot of the challenges. I'm more pessimistic about how we can actually drive society and get an acceptance from society in terms of the transitions we see. You touched upon it, Jerry, in terms of values and so on. How do you see the research needs, the development or innovation needs in terms of societal transformation more from the socioeconomic dimensions? Because otherwise, well, Brexit, elections in the US, next elections in the EU, we have challenges there if we cannot get that acceptance for the development that we need.
Excellent question, which I think ties also in the previous one. And then the last question there. Yeah, I think there's a microphone right next to you. Yeah.
Okay, sorry, I've never been here before. Okay, we have a politician.
Brief question, please. Yeah, just a brief question because we're ready. Yeah.
Oh, no, don't worry. I'm going to be briefer than anyone who has been speaking here. My name is Jessica Philipson Berg. I work predominantly in the NGO sector, but also innovation. So my question is really to everyone. We have a politician here who talks a lot about focusing on Sweden. Sweden is the focus here. We have Jerry talking about transnational cooperation. We're talking from our embassy experts here, who I wish were standing up there, saying, let's focus on a transnational cooperation, let's focus on et cetera, et cetera. So my question is a little bit directed to all of you. How do we see if we're having maybe the government thinking more about let's focus on Sweden, and then we have other experts actually saying, well, actually, let's do more transnational cooperation. So what do you guys think about that? Not only the minister, but for everyone there.
Thank you very much, and I know we're really pressed, so if just pick one of the questions, and we'll do a last round. You want to start, Sarah?
Yes, then I pick Johan's questions. I think you're right, Johan. When it comes to technology, I'm sure we'll develop fantastic technologies, but how can we ensure that they're used by society? And that is exactly why we have the WASP HS program, where HS stands for Humanity and Society, doing research on ethics on automation systems and AI, responsible use, laws, regulations, impact on economic system, impact on social systems, and impact on information systems, because we need to understand that to really make use of the technologies. So 100% right.
Thank you. Jerry?
Yeah, so I think maybe a similar answer to all 3 of the questions: engagement, 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 right? It's engagement with society through a whole range of different mechanisms. It can be some citizen science, it can be better scientific communication. It's through open science, right, that helps make the process and the results of science more tangible to our communities. I think when it comes to policy making, it also entails stakeholder engagement, right? So it's not just about getting the R&D factors right, but it's about engaging communities and helping set objectives and priorities, many of which are becoming more societally driven, whether it's healthcare as the first question, or climate, right? So we need to understand the interests of individuals and communities and use that to help shape our STI agendas. And one of the lessons we learned from the pandemic, right, where we were focused on IT and we were focused on health-related research, social sciences research was actually incredibly important in understanding how will messages be perceived and change behaviors. And I think that's another piece of the fabric. We focus a lot on the high-tech industries, but it's as much an issue of social science as well. And then I would say engagement, again, it is international engagement. I think international engagement can help advance Swedish priorities, but it needs to be understood by what are the Swedish priorities, where are the strategies, what are the goals that you're trying to achieve.
Thank you, Minister.
I totally agree, and I think that was a very interesting and good question. I mean, how the climate policy, to some extent, we know what kind of policy we can adopt and implement, but there needs to be a public support, and we have seen in so many countries, France recently, that is lacking. So there is a need for more knowledge about that mechanism, definitely.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry I rushed you at the end, but I think it was a really interesting seminar and discussion. I want to thank all of you for participating, especially the panelists and the speakers. And I think we finished off two things that we didn't really address enough was, how important is European regulation, but that we have to leave for another moment. And also tying into the final questions, talent. I know attracting global talent. I think the Wallenberg Foundation does a lot to do that, but are we doing enough? Are we seizing the opportunities in Sweden, which I think will be essential if we're going to be in this game. With that, I want to thank you all. I hope this was relevant and interesting to you, and see you on another occasion. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you.